For the first meeting of the new year with the Baton Rouge Press Club. We have a very special guest to kick off the year. Governor John Bel Edwards is here to talk to us a little bit about the first half of his first term in office, and also looking ahead to this year. And I'm sure you've probably heard a little something about the fiscal cliff that the state faces. Governor John Bel Edwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation and the introduction, and it is a pleasure to be here with you to start the new year in 2018. It's already off to a great start. I've had a couple of good duck hunts, and late last year I was able to go to the LSU football practice and throw the football a little bit. So it's a great Saints game yesterday, and they get to play again this weekend. But I appreciate all that you all do year-round. I think it's going to be a great year for the state in 2018. Hopefully it will be for you individually and your families as well. But that doesn't mean we don't have significant challenges. Indeed we do. Chief among those challenges are the looming fiscal cliff and the continuing need to enact long-term structural budget and tax reform. But having said that, I will tell you I am genuinely excited about 2018. I'm excited about the future of our great state. So today I'm going to talk about where we stand with the budget, principally about the fiscal cliff, the plan that I have proposed, and shortly after that I will open the floor to questions. Just a quick recap on how we got here. And I know that you remember this, but sometimes we forget to talk about it, and it still informs what's going on today. And that is that we had a $2 billion state general fund deficit that I inherited in the fiscal year that the first full fiscal year after I became governor. And that's because, in large part, for many years, we had budgeting in Louisiana that was driven by tricks and gimmicks. We had the unprecedented use of one-time money, including $800 million in one-time money in the budget for the year that I actually became governor. And at the same time, over those 8 years, trust funds were depleted by $3 billion in Louisiana as they were swept and incorporated into the budget with no effort really to marry up recurring revenues to pay for recurring expenditures. In the short term, by ending the dishonest and gimmicky budgets, we've restored honesty to the budget process. And in fact, I would tell you that the current budget is probably the best budget, the most responsible budget that we've had in many, many years. There is no one-time money in that budget. We also took a balanced approach of cuts in revenue and savings in order to address the $2 billion budget deficit that I just told you about. And we've actually cut more than $600 million state general fund. We achieved savings the first year on the Medicaid expansion of about $200 million. In the current fiscal year, that savings is closer to $300 million. And certainly we had to raise revenue to make up the difference. And the revenue was raised in a temporary way for the most part, in the sense that the fifth penny of sales tax was sunsetted after 27 months. And in the intervening period, the legislature committed itself to studying and adopting long-term structural tax and budget reform. It just hadn't got around to doing that yet. And that's the problem. That's why the cliff looms on June 30th when $1,074 million in revenue falls off the books. Now, that doesn't count the continuation budget issue. When we talk about the cliff, I'm talking about the revenue that's falling off the books. But the continuation budget shortfall is in the neighborhood of $450 million. Now, the legislature failed to enact budget and tax reform in 2017, even though that was the last fiscal session before the fiscal cliff. In fact, not a single bill made it out of the Ways and Means Committee for consideration by the House floor. So we still have the challenge of finding a way to replace the revenue that's fallen off the books, or to cut more than $1 billion out of the discretionary state general fund, which totals $3.5 billion. And that's why it's such a difficult challenge. As you all should be aware, the only two big pots of money in that $3.5 billion of discretionary state general fund are higher education and health care. Precisely the two areas where I'm told over and over and over as I travel the state that people do not want the state of Louisiana to make these types of cuts. So fixing the cliff is priority number one. It's very difficult because I don't believe that anyone wants to pass a budget that makes the cuts, and the legislature has been very slow to make the permanent fixes on the revenue. But with respect to the revenue, I think it bears mentioning. I am not asking for more revenue next year. I want to replace dollar for dollar the temporary measures that are set to expire on June 30th. So I'm not looking for net new revenue as it relates to the cliff. I also want to remind you that I've cut over $600 million since I became governor. And in fact, the state general fund in the current year's budget is $1 billion less than it was 10 years ago. That's why additional cuts are so difficult to make. Why is it important that we fix this problem? Because we are positioned as a state to enter an era of prosperity that we haven't seen in a while. Prosperity that's going to benefit all of the people in Louisiana, every geographic region, every sector of our economy. And we have a lot of signs that point in that direction now. For example, unemployment is at 4.7%, the lowest it's been since May of 2008. We recently announced DXC Technology will create 2,000 direct permanent jobs at one site on Poydras Street in New Orleans. These are clean, technology-driven jobs so that they can run a digital transformation center in New Orleans. And in fact, just last week, Business Facilities Magazine's named that the second best economic development deal in the country for 2017. And really the good news about that deal from my perspective is that half of the upfront money is actually going to go to higher education. So it's going to move from the Department of Economic Development and go to higher education so that our higher education institutions, both four-year institutions and the Louisiana Community Technical College system, will have the education in place to train the workforce that DXC Technologies is going to rely upon. And I will tell you this, from my meetings with the folks at DXC Technologies, if Louisiana had not been committed to higher education in the current budget year, if we had not gotten through that session last year the way we did, we would likely not have landed that deal. Because the most important consideration now going forward for these companies is whether they're going to invest their money in Louisiana to either expand their current operations or to invest in a new operation, is the state committed to the workforce development so that it will have the trained, educated, skilled employees that they will need for success. We were able to convince them that we were committed. We delivered on a budget for the first time in 10 years, did not cut higher education relative to the previous year, and fully funded TOPS. And I'm here to tell you that it is in our best interest as a state to continue to be committed to higher education and continue to deliver those results if we're going to be successful. If we're going to have a state that we want for our children and grandchildren with all the opportunities right here in Louisiana for them. Additionally, Louisiana ranks number 5 in the top states for doing business according to Area Development Magazine. Louisiana ranks number 4 among small business-friendly states according to thumbtack.com, which gave Louisiana an A+ grade for its support for small businesses. We have more direct foreign investment in Louisiana on a per capita basis than any other state in the nation, and if you forget about the per capita, we're number 2 in the country. We are also seeing that this news is paying dividends in terms of stabilizing revenue for the state of Louisiana. Now, the most important thing is everyone who's getting those jobs out there, the revenue is being stabilized for their families. But it's also having a positive impact on the state. For example, in the current fiscal year, The revenue was upgraded by $153 million. For the next fiscal year, the revenue was upgraded in terms of the forecast by $234 million. And for the fiscal year that just ended on June 30th, we actually ended that year with a $120 million surplus. Now, it's been a long time in Louisiana since we talked about surpluses and no mid-year budget cuts. And by the way, those are the most destabilizing of all. And that's why stability and predictability are as important to the state as they are for families and for businesses. Now, all of these positive changes in the revenue forecast certainly help, but they don't solve our problems. They don't address the cliff that I just mentioned. And in fact, if you took the entire enhanced forecast for next year, that $234 million, that's about half of the continuation budget shortfall that we have in Louisiana. On January the 19th, Commissioner Jay Darden and I will present to the Joint Legislative Committee on the budget the executive budget proposal for next fiscal year. As mandated by the Constitution, that budget proposal will be in balance, and therefore only the revenue forecasted by REC will be incorporated. And therefore, we will be making more than $1 billion in cuts to the $3.5 billion of discretionary state general fund expenditures. It is not going to be pretty. It will not reflect a budget that I want to see implemented. And in fact, the cuts will be devastating, and they will be across all areas of that $3.5 billion. And because of where the money is, you will see the lion's share of those cuts directed to health care and higher education. And I don't want to implement any of those cuts. I believe we're on a great course now, and I want to make sure that we replace the revenue that we're losing so that we can maintain the stability that we currently have that is moving our state in such a positive direction. Now, the plan. As you know, last year, even though it was the last fiscal session before the fiscal cliff, the legislature could not come to a consensus. Not a single bill to address the cliff moved out of the Ways and Means Committee for consideration by the House as a whole. And in fact, we've actually had 6 sessions since I've been governor. And in 3 of those, we dealt with changes that would have been permanent. And they have not taken action in any of those 6 sessions in order to address this cliff. And so we know the situation. I do not intend to call a special session in February, which is when we need to have it, with the regular session starting in March, absent some agreement in principle between myself and legislative leadership as to how we would address the fiscal cliff. The simple fact of the matter is getting a 2/3 vote on any of these options is very, very difficult without leadership pushing in the same direction. Now, I do believe we should do it in February for many, many reasons. First among them is, I will tell you, I think it's very unlikely that the legislature will ever pass a budget in the session that starts in March if it has to make the kind of cuts that we're going to be talking about. Just won't happen. Secondly, capital outlay. We have to have the revenue in order to meet our debt service obligations, and if we lose $1 billion in revenue, $60 million just disappears. It evaporates out of the capital outlay program because you're limited to 6% of your revenue as far as what you can actually bond out. But more than that, credit rating agencies will be looking at the state of Louisiana, and certainly if we don't fix our problems in February, and we're relegated to trying to do that in the last 3 weeks of June before the July 1st new fiscal year hits, we're not going to inspire confidence in those credit rating agencies. We're not going to inspire confidence in investors, in businesses outside of Louisiana or inside of Louisiana, that they ought to be stepping up their investments here. Parents and students won't know what their tuition is going to be, how much TOPS will pay towards the tuition, what the Go Grant situation is going to be for needy higher education students. Higher education institutions won't know what their budget is going to be. And right now, and I want you to reflect on this for just a moment and see how far we've come in such a short period of time. LSU is experiencing right now, this is our land grant flagship institution, a 28% increase over the current academic year in terms of students who are seeking admission next year in-state. It's more than 50% increase for out-of-state students. And this is being played out at different institutions and in different systems across the state of Louisiana, not just LSU. Layoff notices in both the public and private sector will be required in the month of June because you have to give people notice that you won't have the money to pay their salary. And why the private sector too? Because we have partners out there, particularly partner hospitals, that would not be able to count on funding if we don't fix the cliff. So the confidence that we need to continue to inspire in Louisiana and outside of Louisiana, that will be very difficult to do if we don't fix the cliff. And I'll repeat again, fixing the cliff doesn't require any new revenue next year. We just need to replace what is falling off the books, and which, by the way, was designed to be temporary. Now, I have conducted right at 30 meetings around the state, business roundtable meetings, meetings with local elected officials, all of whom tell me that we need stability and predictability here in Louisiana, and I concur with that completely. You know, the simple fact of the matter is Louisiana has one of the 10 most complex tax systems to administer and to comply with, but we have the 5th lowest state and local tax burden. That just doesn't make sense. We're not proposing anything new. In fact, I had this conversation when I came in with a few of you. We've actually had study after study for the last several decades in Louisiana about what needs to happen. And in fact, the legislature created a task force that studied this situation and made recommendations, and I am embracing those recommendations. So in that sense, I'm giving back the legislature its plan to fix the cliff. And it's just time that we get it done. This is what it looks like. Making permanent the reductions to tax credits, deductions, and rebates that were primarily enacted in 2015, but that will be sunsetting on June 30th of this year. Compressing income tax brackets and reducing the excess itemized deductions from 100% to 50%. Removing the 5th penny of sales tax because it was designed to be temporary. That should happen. While cleaning up the remaining 4 pennies. One of the things that causes us to have such a hard system to administer is all of the pennies are taxed at different amounts. That's just not the way to run a tax system, and we ought to have the 4 pennies that we keep be as clean as the penny that we will lose. And by the way, that 5th penny should go away because the sales tax is by its nature a regressive tax, and the only place in the country where we're an outlier in terms of our tax system is with respect to the sales tax. Because if you look at the combined sales tax at the state and local levels, the average is 10.02%, the highest in the country. I don't believe we should have the highest tax type of any kind in the country, and so we need to get to the business of permanent reform. Adjusting business utilities tax to 4% and industrial utilities to 2%. And expanding sales tax to certain services based on the Texas model. And certainly, as you all know, I've released that plan weeks ago. Again, it comes from the task force that actually met last year and issued its report early in the fall. So there's nothing new there. And I am certainly willing to be flexible. But I've got to have some plan that comes back from the legislature. At some point, saying no has to give way to an alternative, something that they can support. Saying no to everything and offering no alternative actually is the biggest part of the problem, and that's what we have to get past. Now, there are some things that make this a little bit more difficult than we would like it to be. One of those things is analyzing the impact of federal tax changes that just happened in Washington and what that impact will be on our revenue, how we can model it so that we can get to a certain level of confidence that REC will recognize additional revenue, hopefully, but how much and when, because that's a big part of fixing this problem as well. And we don't have the answer there. Generally speaking, and I think some of you saw it in the media this weekend, generally speaking, the lower the federal tax bill in terms of the income tax, the more revenue we will see at the state side because of the deductions for federal tax liability. But modeling that is incredibly difficult because they didn't just change the tax rates for corporations and individuals. They also changed the way flow-through entities, LLCs primarily, will be taxed, and they also increased the standard deduction. So we have to figure out those changes plus a host of other changes and what they will do to the state of Louisiana. So we'll be very flexible because hopefully over the next several weeks we will get more information about that and we can get an idea of what the REC will do and when. And by the way, if whatever that amount is, if there's going to be a permanent increase in revenue in Louisiana because of that, I am willing to use some part of that fifth penny to bridge us to that point. What I'm unwilling to do is just use the fifth penny itself to fix the problem because that's not the way it was designed, and we know how to fix it. We just have to make sure that we do it. Now, another thing that I will mention is in the special session, when we have it, and hopefully it'll be in February, there will also be a call item so that we can pass legislation in Louisiana so that taxpayers who take advantage of the changes in federal tax law related to the disasters here in Louisiana in 2016 don't inadvertently incur a higher state tax as a result of that. And it'll be modeled off of legislation that was done after Katrina for the same thing. So that will be part of the call as well. So in conclusion, I would just tell you it's time to get it fixed. We know how to fix it. We just have to summon the will, the courage to get it done. I am willing to be flexible, but I have to have a plan from the legislature, something that they have been unwilling to put forward up to now. I will continue to meet with legislative leadership, and in fact, I have a meeting later this afternoon. But they can't say no to everything. I will tell you that we still have a very difficult budget year ahead. Even if we replace all of the revenue that's falling off the books and address the cliff, as I've mentioned, because of the continuation budget items that we have to deal with. And again, those items are about $450 million. The spending cut proposal that I received needs to be specific, and I'm actually optimistic that we're going to get the job done. But we ought to get it done in February. That's the orderly way to do it. That's the way that causes the least amount of disruption, not just to the state. I'm not worried about me and Jay Darden and my team. We're going to be fine. But to all those parents out there, all those kids in higher education, all of those business people trying to decide where they're going to invest their money. For all of those reasons, we need to get this done. And when we do, we will turn the corner, and we're going to have that era of prosperity that I was talking about that, quite frankly, we haven't seen in Louisiana in some time. And I'm very optimistic about that. That's why I think 2018 is going to be a great year. And with that, I'm going to slip over and get my water and then come back and take some questions. Thank you.
Just one little bit of housekeeping before the questions start. In the interest of time and the governor's busy schedule, we just ask that you keep the questions limited to members of the credentialed media and the press club. Thank you.
And since I don't know who's credentialed and who isn't, Somebody's going to have to help me with that, perhaps. Melinda, I think you're probably credentialed.
I have a bag. They let me in the building. So I didn't hear you mention the January 19th deadline for reaching that agreement in principle. Is that still a hard deadline in your mind? Or is that flexible?
Well, it's a deadline. That's the day we present the executive budget proposal. And it's as good a day as any to have a deadline. Now, if we continue to meet, and I'll meet with House legislative leadership today, if we're making progress and we're just not quite there by the 19th, I can extend it, but you can't extend it indefinitely for, just purely logistical reasons. We have a certain window when the special session would fit. It falls between Mardi Gras and the start of the regular session, which is the 12th of March, the second Monday in March. And you have to have 7 days between the time you issue the call and when you can convene the legislature. So if you just start looking at the calendar, you can't wait forever. But if there's just no progress, for example, we've been waiting for literally 2 years to get a plan from the legislature. If that doesn't change, then we're just not going to have a session. But if we are making progress, then there is some flexibility on the January 19th deadline. Louis Wren.
Yes, Louis Wren.
Is he credentialed? Okay.
In Sunday's paper, Representative Seabaugh was quoted as saying your administration's assertion that you had done budget cuts was a lie. It's obvious to me Mr. Seabaugh wasn't paying attention in class. But how do you respond?
Well, that's the same Mr. Seabaugh that said I didn't go to Ranger School. And this is about as ridiculous. And by the way, Alan's been a legislator for a while. He ought to know better. I think he does know better. And if he knows better and he's willing to say such things, then certainly I'm not the one who's lying. The budget cuts actually have exceeded $600 million in state general fund since I've become governor. If you just look at the math, the $2 billion deficit that we inherited, in fact, it was more than $2 billion for the first full fiscal year. I told you we addressed that through about $200 million in savings, principally around the Medicaid expansion. Also through raising revenue, but almost all of that revenue is about to fall off the books. There's a little bit that was permanent, and that difference was made up through cuts. And it exceeds $600 million. I can explain it to Alan. I can't understand it for him. Yes, Sue.
You said you've been meeting with the legislative leadership for 2 years. Do you trust what they tell you? I mean, because you said that you've gotten one thing from them one time and then they go back and change it. How much trust do you put in what you're hearing?
Well, the thing is, I'm just.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, the question is, in my negotiations with legislative leadership, principally the House, how much trust do I have in what they tell me? I have pretty good level of trust in what they tell me. They just don't often tell me much that has any specificity to it. But if you remember, in 2016, we were able to get something done once we got close enough to the new budget year, and they were staring at those really, really deep, nasty cuts. Well, we're going to be back in that same place, and so I think we're going to get this done again. The question is whether they're going to insist on some temporary solution that doesn't really fix the problem. It just kicks it down the road, despite the fact that for decades, good government groups have been sponsoring studies of our tax and our budget system and have been making these same recommendations. Is this the year we're finally going to summon the courage and come up with the will to actually do the people's business and get it done and create that stability and predictability that we need, but also to create more fairness around our tax system? And I think it is. I'm actually optimistic, but I will certainly know more over the next few days as we continue to meet and I see what sorts of ideas House leadership wants to pursue. Yes, sir.
Hi, Governor. So there are obviously discussions with House GOP leaders over the past few weeks, and their claim is that they have reached out in some semblance to the administration. They just don't have an idea as to the fiscal estimates with your plans. Your response to that?
Well, that just isn't so. I mean, I don't even know how to respond to that. They've never come with anything that looks like a plan. The last time I talked to House leadership, they were still surveying their members around the menu of options to try to see what they could support. And of course, the options aren't different than what we considered 2 years ago, or last year, or now. And so we have not seen anything that looks like a plan at all. And I would remind you, every single task force recommendation to fix this problem was pending as a bill in the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives in the fiscal session that concluded in June of 2017. Not a single bill came out of the committee. And since that time, there's been nothing that looks like a plan that has been proposed to me. Maybe today will be the day. I'm hopeful. Yes, ma'am.
Governor, I know a lot of your attention right now is obviously on the fiscal cliff, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what your agenda might be for the general session.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a regular session of a general nature, and it's almost 3 months in length, and we're certainly going to be looking at a number of things that we're going to do to try to move the state forward. For example, you can anticipate that we're going to do some things to legislatively make sure that we're doing an even better job with respect to the way we deal with small businesses and making sure the climate in Louisiana is conducive to small businesses being able to flourish and thrive, because they really do the best job in terms of hiring Louisianans. And so that's really important, and you can look for an initiative there with the Department of Economic Development. You can look for us to, again, ask for an increase in the minimum wage. You know, the simple fact of the matter is that on January 1st, I think there were 18 states and maybe a few cities in there where the minimum wage actually increased, and Louisiana is increasingly an outlier in that area. But the federal minimum wage in 2018 is wholly insufficient, and we need to increase that so working men and women have a fair opportunity to get ahead and support themselves and their kids. You will look for us again to try to eliminate the pay gap, which is the worst in the country, right here in Louisiana, something that ought to offend everybody sitting here, between what we pay men and women when they have similar qualifications doing the same job. We have to make sure that we do better on that. We are looking at ways to end regulations that have been on the books in multiple agencies for years without ever being looked at to see whether it continues to be necessary or whether it can be revised so that hopefully the revisions or the repeal of those regulations would actually allow people doing business in Louisiana to be able to do business in a way that's less burdensome, less costly, and so forth, without jeopardizing anything that is important to our state. So we're looking at that. You know, we have more boards that license occupations in Louisiana. I think there are 71 occupations that are licensed by boards in Louisiana than any other state in the nation. I think we're the only state that licenses florists. I'm not sure why we do that. I think we ought to take a look at that. And that's another thing we can do for small business people, not just on florists, but across the board. You're going to see us working to try to make sure that we can come up with a reasonable work/education/volunteering requirement for certain individuals who are on Medicaid. We're working with the same consulting firm, in fact, that worked with the state of Kentucky and is working with some other states to make sure that we do that in Louisiana. So there are no shortage of things to tackle in the session that's coming up. And you can look forward to a robust agenda that I will discuss more going forward, but certainly on the first day of the legislative session.
Governor,
I guess I'll call on you. Yes, sir.
I was born in Syria
Yes, sir.
72.5 years ago. I am a Syrian Army draft dodger. I was a uniformed services civilian in Iran, translator. Let some refugees come home. Please, we have 2 centuries we've been here.
Yes, sir. I don't believe I play a role on refugee resettlement. I don't, but I hear what you're saying, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but the fact of the matter is that's run by the federal government through non-governmental organizations, in fact, at least in this state, through Catholic Charities, but I hear what you're saying. Yes, sir.
You know, the House, or at least the leadership in the House, seems to have been remarkably resistant to all the dreadful consequences so far. But you got 53 votes on the key vote in the last budget. Does that suggest, one, how much this requires 70 votes, which appears to be a real hurdle, and two, is there in fact a majority in the House that is not that of the Speaker and the Chairman of the relevant committee?
Yeah, well, you know, I personally believe that there's 56, 57 votes in the House to do just about everything that I mentioned. The difference between 56 and 70 is obviously 14, but getting that 14 is very hard. And you really can't get it without leadership being in support of what you're trying to do. And about half of the items I talked about require a simple majority vote. For example, excess itemized deductions, 53 votes in the House. To extend or eliminate the sunset on the reduction of those tax credits, those rebates and those deductions, that's also a simple majority. But if you're looking at some of the other changes, then it would be a 2/3. And that's why we have, and you say they're resistant. They're resistant to everything because they don't want to fix the problem, but they also don't want to try to pass a budget that doesn't reflect the revenue necessary to fix the problem. But at some point, you have to fish or cut bait, and you know we're going to be there, and that really is the difference. I guess sometimes in order to focus your mind about a cliff, your toes have to be dangling off the edge. We're getting close to that. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us the last time you talked in person to Lance Harris or Cameron Henry and also the speaker?
Talked to the speaker last week. I will be meeting with the speaker and Lance and others later today. As far as Cameron goes, I really am not sure. I mean, it hasn't been that long ago, but it hasn't been as recently as I spoke with Cameron, I'm sorry, with Lance or Taylor. But we're focused more right now on the revenue side. So it's a ways and means issue primarily, not so much an appropriations issue in the meantime. Now, I'm trying to make sure that there's enough revenue that Representative Henry can get an appropriations bill passed in the regular session. And so certainly at some point, the focus will shift to that. Yes, sir.
Governor, given the civil lawsuits that have been filed against the Office of Inspector General, cases like Murphy Painter, Corey Dillon Doucet, how much confidence do you have in Stephen Street, and has your administration ever considered defunding that office to save approximately $3 million?
I have confidence in Stephen Street. We've considered defunding everything because of the cliff. So, but not because that's something that we think would be a good thing to do, and it's not something that we will propose in our executive budget proposal. Yes, sir.
As it relates to the disaster of 2016, Governor, what incentives are the state looking at toward those victims who were affected by that disaster?
Well, in terms of incentives for the victims, well, one of the things that I mentioned is we will, in the special session, have legislation on the call that will make sure that individuals who take advantage of the tax bill that was just passed by Congress. In fact, I want to thank Senator Cassidy because he was the one that made sure that those provisions were included in the tax bill. But their federal taxes for the losses that they sustained in the disasters could be reduced. And if that happens without a corresponding change in the state law, the state taxes would actually go up. So as you amend your federal return to pay less, you would actually be paying more to the state government at the same time. So we don't want that to happen, and so we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen through legislation that we are going to include on the call for the special session, which is another reason why I'd really like to have that session in February, so they have the peace of mind of knowing that's in place. But I will assure all the people of Louisiana that that will happen whenever we get around to the special session, and I don't believe there's any opposition to that. Yes, sir.
Talked a little earlier, mentioned TOPS, when you were talking
Yeah.
about that were fully funded last year. Well, there's been, of course, this task force that has had the whole program under a microscope for the last 3 or 4 months. And among other changes, they talk about ACT, GPA scores, a lot of items that would cut eligibility to thousands. Do you favor those changes?
I don't favor changing TOPS. I favor funding TOPS. It is hard to do. One of the reasons that it's hard to do, quite frankly, is because for 8 years we led the nation in state general fund cuts to higher education, and we offset those cuts in part by having the highest tuition increases in the nation over those same 8 years. Well, TOPS is designed to pay tuition. So every time tuition went up, the cost of the program went up. And so we have a program today that is right at $300 million a year, considerably more expensive than it used to be. The other thing about changes to TOPS, and I believe that the task force contemplated this as well, although I can't tell you for certain, is that typically if you talk about changing TOPS, you don't talk about changing it for anyone who's currently in high school, because you've made a commitment to those students that if they will take certain courses, get a certain GPA in those courses, and have an ACT score of 20 or better, that they would benefit from TOPS as the program is currently constituted. So if you were going to change the program, you'd be changing it for 8th graders. And so this idea that you would change the TOPS as a way to address the shortfall that we're talking about, that is not true. And so what I would prefer that we do is that we keep TOPS as is and that we fund it. Now, having said that, when you cut, or if you cut, over $1 billion out of $3.5 billion in discretionary state general fund expenditures, I can tell you TOPS will not be fully funded. And that's why when we present our executive budget proposal to the legislature on the 19th of this month, we will also present to them a side document telling them the additional revenue we would like to raise and how we would incorporate that revenue into the budget. And again, when I say additional revenue, it's additional only because we have revenue falling off the books. We're trying to replace the revenue dollar for dollar so that we won't have more revenue coming in from those items next fiscal year than we do in the current fiscal year. Okay, I think I got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
If I can do a two-part. One, do you have any updates on the brackets? I know you mentioned that you're still looking at the federal bill, but do you have any updates on those? And two, one of the common GOP talking points is we need more budget reform. Is there anything you would recommend on that front, or something that you would be open to?
With respect to the brackets, we are trying to work we wouldn't go beyond the Stelly brackets in terms of making changes. We're trying to see whether there is something between the current brackets and the Stelly brackets that would work in order to fix this cliff. And the second question was about budget reform. Well, you know, we're wide open on budget reform, but I will tell you, in the 2 years that I've been governor, we've reformed our budget. there's no one-time money in the budget. There are no contingent items in the budget. There's no items above the line and below the line in the budget. As a result, we've actually been able to have an honest conversation about the budget in Louisiana. And so, am I willing to consider other things? Absolutely. And I will do that. I expect those will be part of our meeting today, too. I'm just going to tell you, when the governor and the commissioner of administration present honest budgets that are gimmick-free, the need for budget reform goes down because we have to run a balanced budget. It's not like Congress, where they can contemplate a tax change that's going to add $1.5 trillion of debt over the next 10 years. We just can't do that. And so I'm willing to entertain any specific proposals that they have, but I will tell you, they are less necessary today because of the way that we've run the governor's office and the Division of Administration. I want to thank all of you again for the opportunity to be here. I am more optimistic about the state of Louisiana than I have ever been. I can honestly tell you that. I'm excited about our future, and I recognize the role that you all play when it comes to keeping the citizenry informed and making sure that the First Amendment actually means something. And for that reason, when the president decided not to give the fake news awards today, and he found out I was coming here, he asked me if I would do it instead. I did decline. I'm not going to do that to you. So Happy New Year. God bless.
All right, thank you all for joining us today.